But until the feedback comes, I'm just going to talk and say almost nothing just to waste time and make sure
Fill
that
the
there
air.
is something happening. Okay, the feedback, I think I'm able to kill it. I killed it. Great. My guest today is Jake Swearingen, deputy editor at Business Insider. He's written for Consumer Reports, New York Magazine, The Atlantic, Wired, Slate, and LA Weekly. I remember that one. Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
from LA. So were you in LA when you were writing for LA Weekly?
I did. Yeah, I lived in Los Feliz for about a year.
Oh, that's a great area.
Yeah, I love that area. I miss LA a lot.
Today, we're going to talk about what makes Business Insider unique, their meteoric rise to name brand status on the internet, opportunities for coverage, and the post pandemic retail rebound. Stay with us. I'm here with Jake Swearingen, deputy editor at Business Insider. He was previously technology reporter at Consumer Reports. I can't imagine a more different publication. What a what led to your moving from Consumer Reports to Business Insider?
I mean, that's a really good question. I think uh, one is that got, I had some people reach out to come over to Business Insider that I really respected. So that helped. But also just the chance to come over and work with a group of reporters and editors. I just noticed over 3 or 4 years of reporting how much more and more I would start to look for articles on certain subjects. I reported a lot on Amazon, and I would start to see stories about Amazon coming out of Business Insider and be like, that's really good. Like that's a big scoop. That is a big piece of the pie that, like, previously we didn't understand about Amazon, and that was coming more and more out of Business Insider. So by the time somebody approached me to come over and be an editor over here, I was already interested in Business Insider. They would just seem to be on the tear of just bringing over smart, interesting people to write smart, interesting things for them.
It's a relatively new brand. They came about in 2007. They basically took a bunch of blogs and turned them into a publication. I think it was originally Silicon Valley Watcher, right?
Silicon Alley Insider.
Okay.
If you're asking me to be exact on all the permutations of the brand, I might get it wrong. I think it was Silicon Alley Insider for a while, then Business Insider, then the Business Insider, then back to Business Insider. And we actually, as of earlier this year, we just officially became just Insider. And Business Insider is now sort of a sub vertical of Insider overall, which covers politics, sports, entertainment, and then, of course, business, which is still one of our main interests.
What are the other brands other than Business Insider?
Our other brands are, we have Life, which is a lot of entertainment stuff, a lot of sort of essays about what it's like to be alive right now, obviously always of interest. And then news. We do a lot of just straight news reporting. We have a politics team that's extremely active. We have a DC bureau that we've been building out with some people we brought over from Politico. So those are sort of the main threads, is that we have a business section, a news section, which covers stuff that's sort of outside of the business world. And then we have a life section that covers a bit more of, what you might find in a more magazine style website.
And then you guys were purchased by a German publisher fairly recently, right?
Yeah, I would have to actually look up the exact date on this, but I believe about 2015, we were purchased by Axel Springer, which is a huge German conglomerate. They own a lot of magazines and newspapers throughout Europe. And yeah, they were one of the reasons that that certainly I'm working here, and I think a lot of people are working here, is that they were able to sort of take, I think, what Henry Blodgett, our founder and CEO, was able to start up, and really take that and pour some gas on the fire. So we've been in an expansion period really for the past 2.5, 3 years, able to grow. And at the same time, because the people who lead this company are very on the ball, we've been able to stay profitable as well.
Does any of the coverage that you guys put together wind up in getting translated and moving in any of the European publications that your parent company owns?
I know that so there is, we have some sort of international arms. And I know that sometimes our stories make it over onto the German sites. I think we have BI India, which is written in English, obviously. So there's some crossover, but it's a bit above my pay grade exactly how
Yeah.
that stuff moves around.
And then a lot of stuff from other publications winds up moving on Business Insider, often
Yeah, we
under
have
a
a
different
lot.
brand. Yeah. What are those? What deals are in place for you to take content from other companies?
We have syndication agreements with a lot of outlets. I mean, Reuters being a big one, obviously. But we also sometimes we bring stuff over from Axios, stuff from ProPublica. In my experience, I mean, this again is part of the business that I'm not directly involved in, but these sort of syndication agreements or these partnerships are pretty common at this point between a lot of websites where we sort of understand that it's better for everybody the more that your content gets spread around and gets syndicated to big sites with good reach, which is definitely describes us.
So now, when you were at Consumer Reports and New York Magazine, you were a writer, and now you're a deputy editor. So that's a bit of a shift for you. What does a normal day look like for you at Business Insider?
Um, I mean, I started about 2 weeks before the pandemic shut everything down, so it's hard for me to say what it'll be like once we actually fully open back up. A normal day for me is generally, getting online about 8 o'clock, 8:30. We sort of check in to see what the run of the stories is, check in with the other desks, find out what people are writing on. And then generally it's a mixture of working directly with editors and working directly with reporters to find out what are the bigger stories. That's generally where I step in that we're working on. And then also sort of trying to plot out what we're going to be going after over the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, where the companies that we think are really worth covering right now, what are the places where we think that we could find, a really good scoop, a really good story if we continue to pour more resources into it. So it's a little bit of direct editing, a little bit of direct work with reporters, and a little bit of longer term strategy. As for the actual day to day, it's a lot of doing a lot of video meetings and a lot of slacking back and forth between reporters, editors, and writers.
Before, when you were a technology writer at New York Magazine, just to cover that for a second before we get into Business Insider more,
Mm-hmm.
um, talk to us about that publication for a moment, because you were there almost 3 years. What
Mm-hmm.
makes New York Magazine unique?
I mean, what made New York Magazine unique to me is probably different than I think what a lot of people would latch onto, which is I think the print publication is an amazing product. But for me, when I sort of was coming up as a younger writer, which is really the end of the aughts, what stood out to me about New York Magazine, and one of the reasons I was really excited to join it, was how well that they actually took to the internet. I think that they were one of the first magazines to really figure out how to exist on the internet, particularly the sites Vulture and The Cut, really stand as their own products and really bring a certain level of storytelling and a certain level of journalism to the internet, but still move at the pace of the internet. So that a site like Vulture really figure out how to do both long, sort of really, beautifully written profiles and interviews, and also do short little things where it's just, here's a new trailer, here's a joke about the trailer, and we're done. So for me, I think that, what made it unique, obviously, especially when the time I was there, was the editorial sensibility of Adam Moss and the ability to sort of translate certain viewpoint of very well educated, very smart, very funny people about how they saw New York and how they saw the world at large. For me, what made it unique and the reason that I really loved it is that I felt like they did such a good job of making intensely readable web content, which is a really much, much harder than you may think, unless you've tried to do it for a number of years. It's really hard to write stuff that is actually easy to read and enjoyable and just has that thing of, as soon as you start reading it, you can't stop.
So, the New York Times is the New York Times, but it's really an international publication now. Certainly there's local coverage for local readers, but in my Sunday New York Times, I don't get those local sections. And I think, the coverage, I know that they alter the headline, when they move a story from print to the web, or maybe when they move a story from the web to print, because they probably move online first. Um,
Mhm.
how does a story that works in print differ from a story that works online?
It's a really good question. I think that, almost any story that works online can work for print. I think that in a lot of ways, I think that print has an easier job of it. Once you're reading a print product, you're sort of locked in. You've opened up a magazine and you're flipping through, but you're going to only, your choices of when you're flipping through a newspaper or you're flipping through a magazine are to read the things that are in that newspaper or in that magazine. You're sort of, those are your options. When you're reading something online, your options are literally billions of other things that you could look at. Um, and if you're working in the written word, most of them are going to be a lot of video, a lot of short form video, things like that. But things that maybe are inherently a bit more captivating than the written word. I think that the things that work well for print that translate over to online tend to be the longer cover stories, longer features, the things that you can really sink time, money, and invest into. What you see that doesn't work so well in print, that doesn't translate over into online, tends to be the shorter front of book section stuff, the sort of 250, 500 word things that tend to look really good when they're laid out in a specific way and have a very specific design that you can do in print. But for a digital publication, it's actually really hard to do a custom design for every single piece of content. So things that may look good on the printed page don't always translate well into digital, in my experience, having worked with a lot of print publications that exist on the web.
So, a factory worker is going to be judged by their output, the number of, cars they get off the line, manufactured correctly with no flaws. How are you measured?
I would say we're measured in two ways. I mean, one thing that we're pretty upfront about here is that we follow, we use metrics to see how stories do. So for some of our stories, that means how many page views they do. For a lot of stuff I work on, that's how many subscribers we bring in, because we do have a paid product that we're investing heavily in. A lot of our hires over the past couple of years have been focused on that. So there's definitely, we keep an eye on how many sort of people are looking at a story, how many people are paying to read a story. The other part of it, I would say, that's a little bit harder. That's the sort of quantitative side. The qualitative side that I'm judged on, and that we're judging our stories on, is the stories that we feel like are really advancing a conversation forward, or have, in the parlance of journalism, have impact. So, do we write a story and does it mean that a company changes its policies? Does it change how it does something? Do we write a story and it changes how a government does something? Is it cited in Congress? Things like that. If we can write consistently stories that we feel like are either creating a conversation or continuing a conversation that's going on right now in the zeitgeist, or we can report on something that was previously unknown and it causes an actual change in the world, it's harder to measure. It's much easier to measure page views. It's much easier to measure how many new subscribers you're getting. But if you can do that consistently, you also start to build up a brand and a reputation that is pretty invaluable.
How many page views would make a story successful?
I mean, it sort of depends, and it depends on the publication you're at. Certainly here, our numbers are a lot bigger than they might be at some of the smaller outlets I've worked at. Someplace like LA Weekly, a big hit would barely register here. Generally, I would say, for us, 200,000 page views is sort of like table stakes for a mid-sized hit. And a really big hit for us could be 2, 3, 4, 5 million page views.
How fast would you expect this to come? Would this come over time or right away?
What took the page views or
The
the
page
story?
views.
Generally, that would be over the course of like 24 to 48 hours. Generally, stories that are big hits, they're either you either get all the traffic up front, because it's you have hit on something that people are really looking for, the flip side is that you do have stories, and these are the ones that are a little bit harder to see because, particularly when you're doing traffic, every editor and reporter probably looks at Chartbeat a little too much. The stories that are harder to see are the ones that sort of bring in 400 or 500 page views a day, but they do that consistently over the course of a year, and that adds up to a lot of traffic over time. The sort of long tail hits that are sometimes harder to see when you're just doing something like Chartbeat and looking at real-time analytics, but easier to see once you take a step back.
Are you expected, or your writers are expected to have some level of search engine optimization on the story? Are they consulting popular search terms and making sure that they embrace whatever the popular term is for whatever it is they're writing about, or not really?
I would say that what we want to do is make sure that our stories are that you can find them. So if you are searching for something, we certainly want to make sure that our stories are discoverable. And we want to make sure that we have things like a browser title, so the sort of shorter title that'll appear in Google when you see the story, is a good, both like represents the story well and also generally feels a little bit compelling, or is a little bit captivating. You want to click in and you want to see what's going on. In my experience, it's really, really hard to keyword chase. Once you start getting into, and it's not something that I would encourage our writers to do here, or that we do actively. Once you start trying to chase things like trending topics, or sort of whatever the sort of Google keyword of the moment is, you're getting into a fight with 100 other sort of websites that all they do is chase that traffic, and you might win, you might lose, but you end up you're playing in a game that's very, very crowded with a lot of players, versus for us, we tend to know what does well for us and stick to that, and then just hope that we SEO it correctly, because it is a big way that we readers discover us and that our stories are found.
What percentage of your traffic comes from search?
I would have to look at our analytics suite, but roughly it can vary depending on the vertical and depending on if we're talking about stuff in front of the paywall or behind the paywall. But roughly about 30 to 40%, I think, comes from search.
And are writers expected to turn in several headlines, and do you test headlines?
I love a writer that comes with several headlines. Generally, headlines are something that are worked out between the writer and the editor, and sometimes the editor above them and me. We do A/B testing of headlines a fair amount, using mainly our homepage. So we show a small subset of the audience one headline, another, and we see which one clicks through. Yeah, and we also are not afraid to, if we see a story that we think is good, particularly like one that we really believe in isn't performing, we'll look at it and say, did we get the framing of this wrong? Is the headline off? And put a new headline on it and sort of put it back up and see if it gets traffic or gets subscribers then.
More with Business Insider Deputy Editor Jake Swearingen after this. Jake, other than the must-cover stories from newsmakers like Amazon and Apple, what types of smaller stories is Business Insider interested in?
I would say right now we're really interested in a couple of things. So I sit on the retail desk and the transportation desk, are the two that I oversee. But on retail and specifically, I think we're really curious right now about what happens on e-commerce. They've had, obviously e-commerce has had a tremendous year because of COVID and because people basically, I think, sought out their dopamine through online shopping in some ways. So we're curious to see how resilient that growth has been, how much it sticks around once the world opens back up. There's also been some retail sectors that have done really, really well during the pandemic, grocery being the most obvious. So again, seeing how resilient that is, how much do people that have gotten into the habit of buying most of their food at the grocery store, how much do they keep that once they can just go to any restaurant at any time and not have to worry about, can I eat indoors, outdoors, et cetera. On the flip side, I think that we're also really curious to see things like a lot of the major apparel brands, Gap, J. Crew, et cetera, have really obviously had a terrible year. Nobody was wearing business casual. People weren't buying a lot of clothes that weren't sort of pretty much leisure. And even the athleisure brands didn't do great. To see how they come back, and then to also see how some of the sort of more traditional brick and mortar businesses, sort of what you may think of as the mall brands, how they do as the world opens back up. I think that there's a lot of appetite and a lot of pent up money demand to go back to a nice store and go look and touch the clothes that you want to buy. But I would say those are the main things that we're curious about. We're also just generally, I think that for our audience and what we've made a lot of our what our reputation is built on is finding early disruptors. So anytime that we can find companies that we believe will create a major change in the way that people buy, or at least put a sharp elbow into the entrenched players, we're curious in covering them as well.
But everything you're talking about is major brands, major companies. And even in the context of a startup that's disrupting the marketplace, I'm assuming these are companies that are major companies that you're interested in. Is there an interest in startups and small business at all? I don't see much of that coverage with you guys.
We do we do startup stuff, but for us, there does need to be a certain bar that's crossed before we'll cover a startup. We're not trying to be, I don't know, and this is not pejorative at all. We're not trying to be TechCrunch, where we're going to cover every single company that gets any sort of funding whatsoever. We generally want to cover companies that we feel like are both getting investor dollars right now, because there's just a lot of money sloshing around. So investor dollars don't even necessarily clear a bar for us. They need to be bringing in investor dollars and then also be doing something that we think is genuinely interesting. Whether that's they have a mode of business that we think is interesting, they have a way of standing out in the marketplace that's interesting. A story that we did recently that our readers really loved is about a chocolate company in Canada called Midday Squares that sort of does what's in the retail and the consumer packaged goods space is called functional foods, so sort of high performing foods that are supposed to give you a little extra boost. Midday Square sells a chocolate bar you're supposed to buy in the middle of the day. They're based in Canada, and they did a Instagram reality show, and they were able to get enough buzz, and also were doing well enough in sales that they actually turned down an acquisition offer from Hershey's. So that that for us is sort of a perfect smaller company story. It is a brand that you probably haven't heard of. They're coming to the US soon. They project about 10 million revenue for this year. But they have a nice hook in that, they're a company that Hershey's was interested in. And they also have this interesting sort of marketing approach that, may not work for every startup. I definitely wouldn't think that every startup should do a reality show, but for them actually got them a pretty sizable audience, even outside of the people who maybe would follow a consumer packaged good company.
60 Minutes this week ran a story about the Greenwood massacre by a white mob that burned down what was called Black Wall Street. And it's 100 years ago. It's the anniversary. And so, they're covering it today, and there's a wave of coverage now around systemic injustice, which was, obviously in back then, the media must have been complicit in silencing this stuff and not covering it. And now we have this wave of stories that are sort of opening our eyes to systemic injustice that we really didn't know about. A lot of us, I certainly didn't. Is there a parallel in business journalism? Is there an untold story that's not getting told that you'd like to see told?
I'd want to be, well, first of all, I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And
wow.
I'd want to be.
What a coincidence. Oh my God.
I'd want to be very, very careful about drawing any parallels between both what happened in Tulsa and generally what you saw in the media coverage of George Floyd, which was exposing a lot of deep-seated systemic problems that may not have been obvious to a lot of readers who weren't readers of color, but were obvious to a lot of people who had experienced a lot of very terrible things firsthand, to any sort of business parallel. I just to say that would be a little bit of an uncomfortable thing. That said, I do think that, if you were talking about, are there smaller business stories that are going uncovered right now that I feel like that the media at large should be covering more? Yeah, absolutely. I think that there, I think that the media probably was not skeptical enough during the early SPAC craze. It was just sort of initial, wow, there's a lot of money coming in, and a lot of these companies are getting a lot, without sort of the attendant skepticism that we probably should have brought to that. I would also say that we it's a bit of a feedback problem, I would say, between both our audience and then ourselves, is that very, very small companies that could go on to do a lot. But when we're just writing about potential, when we're just writing about the opportunity, we tend to see that audiences don't really respond to just like, this could be big someday. Audiences really want to know about what is becoming big right now. And so because audiences don't respond to that, we tend to not cover it very much. We probably miss some of the companies that are going to, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, be huge, because we just are not interested in sort of covering that very, very small time stuff. But that's also the difference between, say, what we're doing and, a much more focused trade publication might be doing, where to some degree, if you're really heavily involved in that space and you are a smaller company or representing a smaller company, your time may be better spent going after the smaller trade publication, because we certainly look at what the trade publications are doing as sort of an early barometer for what may be bubbling up into a general reader consciousness.
How many pitches are you getting from PR people daily?
I mean, for me, I'm probably getting, I don't know. I mean, I filter most of them, so I don't actually see most of them. And I am a deputy editor, so I don't get that many direct pitches. Probably 20 or 30 a day. I know that when I was an active reporter, I would get hundreds a day. And yeah, I think that for every reporter who publishes almost anywhere, the pure amount of signal that you get makes it really hard to pick out noise. Or excuse me, I think I reversed that. The amount of noise you get makes it hard to pick out the signal. You get so many pitches that even if you wanted to read all of them, you couldn't. And if you do try to sort of, if you get to the point where you're like, oh, I don't have a story for my editor today, and you start going through your PR pitch list, they can also start to feel very one note and samey. It can be hard to distinguish through them, as my experience.
So how many on average would you say you actually read? And I'm curious to know, of the filtering, what do you filter out?
I mean, I just have by my Gmail automatically sort of sorts stuff into like, here's stuff from people, that Gmail basically designates as like, this is important. And then there's a separate folder that's basically like promotions, which is where most of the PR stuff goes. I would say that, I will generally look for stuff. I will generally open anything, and this is getting more to my own personal interests, anything that is sort of talking about companies, the smaller companies that are sort of creating ancillary economies around Amazon. I'm really interested in that. I think that one of the stories that's been told a few times, but that we should be continuing to watch, is the roll up and the consolidation of third-party sellers on Amazon's marketplace right now. I'm generally pretty interested in anything D2C. Is generally, I'll at least like look at the pitch for a second and see if I should like forward it along to one of the reporters.
That's direct to consumer, yes?
Yeah, direct to consumer. So the brands that are generally avoiding, trying to get onto retail shelves and avoiding the middleman, your Warby Parkers.
That is such an exciting category. I got to tell you, in Los Angeles, pretty much all the warehouse space that's left, because most of the warehouse space downtown was converted to creative office space, is being used by D2C companies. Many are small brands you've never heard of, who are doing 20, 30, 40 million a year in 15 to 20,000 square feet. bringing something in, usually from China, assembling it, printing a logo on it, taking a picture of it, and then selling it direct to consumer with a website. It's amazing how that is just flourishing, even during the
Yeah.
pandemic.
I mean, I think the pandemic actually probably helped some of those brands lift off. I know that I was certainly, um, I know that I certainly was guilty of doing the Instagram scroll and then getting my eye caught by a nice watch, or a better pair of sweatpants, and being like, you know what, sure, let's do it, in a way that maybe not during the pandemic I might not have been quite as enticed to do that. Yeah, it's, I think D2C is something that really we're still in early days about how big that category can grow.
What's a good length for a PR pitch?
I think a good length for a PR pitch is 300 words. I mean, you probably, I would say that the best pitches generally tend to not be very long. I know that for PR people, there's the tendency and the hope that if you sort of give me a Wikipedia entry about your client, that I'm going to, I'll read it and I'll have everything I need, and then I'll just be ready to go to write a story. But the reality is that you probably want to leave some of it out. And if I'm interested, I'll follow up. There's nothing I would never get a PR pitch and then just immediately go to write on it. When I was a reporter, and if any of my reporters did that now, I'd be very angry. So you generally want a tight pitch of 200 to 300 words. The ones, when I was a reporter, the ones that I appreciated were the ones that showed that they had at least taken the time to go through my byline and see what I actually covered. And would say, I saw that you wrote this about this company. I have something that's similar, or I have something that's in the same vein. Would you like to take a look? And that's more interesting to me. Now I still get a lot of pitches that, say like, I love your work on Business Insider. I love the stories you've been writing. And it's, very funny to me because I don't write stories on Business Insider. I just edit them. My byline, I think, has appeared once on Business Insider. So there's, the cut paste template jobs. You may as well just send it directly into my trash.
Does Business Insider run guest columns?
We do a little bit. They're generally run under our op-ed commentary section, and it's a pretty high bar at this point. I think that there was probably a time where we maybe would have been a little more open to running guest columns. But at this point, we want, if somebody's going to come in and we're going to take a guest column, we want them to have a pretty clear, coherent point of view, and really be saying something that is going to be not just conventional wisdom, that is going to be taking a strong stance on something. And that generally that, the article itself will be backed up with some sort of analysis, insight, data, et cetera. We're not interested in just running a guest column where somebody gives an opinion that's based on just their own life experience to date, unless they have a life experience that's truly extraordinary.
I was speaking to one of the editors at the Los Angeles Times with the editorial page, and he said during the Trump administration, they were getting 300 to 400 guest column pitches a day, and they run 3 a week. So obviously the odds are minuscule, no matter who you are. What kind of odds are they at Business Insider if you were to submit a guest column?
I can't speak because I don't, I'm not the editor in charge of running contributors or running our opinion section. I know that, we generally run about 5 or 6 stories a week under our op-ed banner, I think. So yeah, the odds are long. We generally, even if we were interested in getting somebody to speak at length about their expertise, we would probably still want to do it via a reporter talking to that person and not just have somebody submit their own column. We're not trying to do the Forbes model or something like that.
And you never take guest columns or guest articles from writers for the retail or transportation coverage?
We certainly, we work with freelancers, but in the guest column, sort of in the more sort of, I think in the sense that you mean of sort of, this person is an expert because of their years of business experience, and it gives them a chance to also get some promotional light on their own company or product, no, we don't do that.
Um, so, some of the stories on Business Insider are free, others are only accessible to subscribers. How do you decide what to make free versus premium?
Um, it is something that we're still figuring out. I would say that we tend to things that are going to be premium are times where we feel like we have exclusive information, so something that you're not going to be able to read anywhere else. We don't put things that what we would call commodity news. So something about a company earnings report, a lot of places are going to have that. There's no reason to put that behind a paywall. Um, we so it tends to be things where we feel like we have exclusive information. We have a big scoop. We have information about a company that we feel like people would pay to read. I think that really, at the end of the day, for us, when we do stuff for behind the paywall, the real question is, why would somebody pay to read this? And it's sort of figuring out, do we have a value proposition in this article that makes sense to our readers? Generally. So generally for us, that just means things that take, 3 or 4 days of reporting versus, 3 or 4 hours. Not always. Sometimes we have stuff that our writers work on very fast and we get up very fast behind the paywall. But generally there are stories that take a little bit longer to work on as well.
We're talking to Jake Swearingen. He is the deputy editor at Business Insider, and we're going to discuss the post-pandemic retail recovery more when we return. Stay with us. Jake, based on the fact that you're the deputy editor on the retail desk, so you're seeing a lot of news about retail, and you've been leading that in that position over the course of the pandemic. What is your sense on what the future of retail looks like?
Boy, I think if I had a really strong, clear picture of that, I would probably be making more money than I am right now. But I do think that my sense of the future of retail is that it is probably one where I think the death of brick and mortar has been sort of overstated. I think that coming out of the pandemic, there's going to be a renewed appreciation of the joys of going someplace and shopping in person versus buying things over the internet, which can feel a little antiseptic or just like a little clinical. You don't get the visceral rush of just going and buying something in person. All that said, I think the overwhelming trends that we saw happening that we thought were going to take 10 or 15 years, the huge rise of e-commerce, the move towards things like delivery grocery shopping, the moves towards having a lot more subscription products that are sort of daily, everyday items for around your house, subscriptions to diapers, subscriptions to house care products. All of that's going to accelerate. I think that you will probably continue to see consolidation in the marketplace. We saw Etsy buying Depop today for about $1 billion. I think that's only going to pick up steam. I think that overall, the market will tend to favor big companies getting bigger and small companies either really rushing to take on enough funding that they can get big enough to fight themselves, or smaller companies getting to a certain point of growth and then getting acquired by large companies.
So many large employers have said that they're not going to require that all their employees come back to the office. What are your expectations for the commercial real estate market moving forward?
That isn't a subject that I have reporters that cover a lot. So this is purely layman's speculation. It seems to me that we probably, in Manhattan right now, I think that Manhattan, a lot of the major urban cores probably overbuilt on commercial real estate. And that certainly what we're seeing, both from the companies we cover and internally as well at our own company is that, a lot of workers who would come and work in office places like this don't want to come in full time. They don't want to work 5 days a week in an office. They want some sort of hybrid, or some of them will probably go full time remote. So I think that future of commercial real estate is probably one where there's fewer people and more space. That space has to be a lot more modular. I'm speaking to you in a conference room that should seat about 20 people. And one of the things that we're going to have to deal with when we get a full crew back into the office is that, I can't do a call like this in an open office, like we would have had, where, I would have had people on either side of me, because it would be like me talking to you with a car running behind me. It would just be very cacophonous. So yeah, my sense is that commercial real estate, I have no idea. If I was a commercial real estate developer or somebody heavily invested in commercial real estate, you might be in for a rough time. For the average office worker, I think that your office is probably about to get a little bit more spacious if you continue to come into an office.
I was in Mid-Wilshire area yesterday, and I was in one of the high rises. And when I got off the elevator in the elevator lobby, I saw that the company I was meeting with was the only one left on the floor. Everything else was empty. Are you seeing the same thing in your building in New York?
We haven't seen, I'm not sure that many people have left out of our building. We're at One Liberty Plaza. I think that you will probably see more and more companies like us, media companies, I'm just thinking in general, probably move down to a smaller footprint in Manhattan, keeping some sort of presence here, but less, not needing as much, because there's just the understanding now that we actually don't need to have people in 5 days a week. And when you don't have people in 5 days a week, your per square footage, even in a place like New York, where the per square footage per employee was pretty small, the requirements are just not going to be there. So no, I can't say that I've seen, empty office towers yet, but it certainly seems like that's the way that things are going to move over the next 5 years.
Given the coverage that you're overseeing, what lesson do you hope small businesses learned from the pandemic?
I think that, one of the things that we've covered a lot has been the restaurant space. And, we were really, I think, during the early pandemic, there was just the sense, I think the small business or the Small Restaurant Association put out something where they said, like 6 out of 10 restaurants were going to be out of business in the next 6 months. And it's been really, really tough for a lot of restaurants, and a lot have gone out of business. A lot of great restaurants here in New York, and across the globe. One of the things that I think has been surprising is that, it was the restaurants that were able to switch up how they did business very quickly, and were able to pivot, in the space of a week or two. And some of them were able to get through, and some of them were able to continue to stay in business. And, some of them, I don't know if any of them are coming out healthier than they did going into the pandemic. Healthier meaning, in a better business place. But I do think that there's probably some restaurants that came out, with more willing to try new things and more willing to try new ways to bring their food to people, whether that, is going heavily into delivery, moving more to a takeout model, cutting down their menu and figuring out, okay, these are the things that we actually need to do if most of our people are picking up our food. I think that's certainly something that I'm interested, that I think is a good lesson. I think, the other lesson that I hope that is picked up is, the labor shortages that we're seeing right now, and that I think a lot of restaurants in particular, but also a lot of retail places are starting to experience. How much of that is dependent on both like money, you have to pay people more. And also a lot of it is dependent on the sense that, your job is being given a certain amount of respect, a certain amount of dignity. So doing things like, ultra flex scheduling starts to go away, that you start to treat people, even people that you know, may not be of the same knowledge worker class as a lot of the management of these larger retail and service establishments, start to treat the workers with a little bit more dignity.
I was speaking with a friend who is involved with a company in LA that is doing food delivery. They're also a kitchen and they're selling their food direct. And they were forced to pivot to Square for Restaurants, which integrates with Postmates and Grubhub and Uber Eats. And while it did allow them to survive, they quickly realized that, wow, we're paying out 15 to 30% on every order. And, in the terms of service, they're restricted from asking their customers for their contact information, so that, the food delivery apps can continue to demand their pound of flesh in perpetuity.
I do. Go ahead. Sorry.
Do you think that restriction is sustainable for online marketplaces and for sellers?
I think that's one of the major open questions when it comes to food delivery. To my knowledge, none of the food delivery vendors, DoorDash, Seamless, Grub, et cetera, have managed to turn a profit off of delivering food to people. But at the same time, they, I think, are increasingly, encountering restaurant operators that are unsatisfied with the margins that they're able to get using these delivery services. Same time, you have a consumer base that got used to ordering food for delivery via these apps during the pandemic, and that may be behavior that's really hard to shift. I think worst case scenario, what you end up doing is, sort of what you're seeing with Uber right now when it comes to, rideshare stuff, which is you got people used to a certain level of service costing a certain price. And then as these companies realize that they have to deliver profitability because like DoorDash, they go public, all of a sudden prices start to get jacked and somebody ends up paying, whether that is, the restaurant, the consumer, somebody. I don't know. I mean, I think that there is certainly, we did a story recently with a guy who was a young kid at Stanford in 2006 or so. Is right, but he coded up a piece of software that allowed people to place food delivery orders before even the iPhone. I think he had just a BlackBerry message, a BBM, if people remember what those were. And it was a nice piece of technology. Grubhub, as it was really starting to get rolling up, it saw this technology. It was like, oh, this is a nice platform. They bought it from him. He sold it. He stayed at Grubhub for about a year. And about a year ago, somebody wrote a Medium post sort of lamenting the current state of food delivery and how, the margins and the fees that they're charging to restaurants can be pretty egregious. And in a late night sort of comment, he wrote, I'm going to mess up the quote directly, but he was basically like, I feel like I helped, facilitate evil. We interviewed him, and I think that, he was a little bit more modulated in his comments to us. He feels like, on the one hand, he feels like it's maybe an exploitative relationship, and he has a new startup where he's trying to figure out a way to make it a better deal for both the restaurant and the delivery operator. I do think that it's, at the end of the day, you're just facing a really tough problem, and that the logistics of getting food from one place to another using a person are really onerous and tough. And I don't think anybody's figured out a way to do it profitably. And so until that actually happens, I'm not sure that anybody's going to be very happy with the arrangement, except for, the customers who are getting delivery largely subsidized off investor dollars.
Granted, they've got deep pockets, but Domino's saw huge growth in on orders filed on their mobile app right after the pandemic. I think the majority of their orders were over the app. I think it was in excess of 75% in the 3 months after the global pandemic was declared. They can obviously afford to develop technology that's robust. They've got this pizza tracker where you order your pizza and you can see what stage it's in the process and when you're going to get it. It's really pretty fantastic. But obviously, small businesses don't have the wherewithal to create something like that, so they wind up relying on these tech brands to get it out
Hmm.
there. But we also saw huge growth with Shopify, a lot of small
Hmm.
business coming online in the e-commerce space. And Shopify doesn't take a commission; they
Hmm.
charge a subscription fee. Uh, so if you think about the position that small businesses are in, and also the importance that small businesses have to an economy, given that they're the number one employer,
Hmm.
any ideas on how small business should be using technology to thrive at a time when the landscape is increasingly dominated by big tech brands?
I mean, I do think that, I think that companies like Shopify are great, and that they do sort of enable small business to very quickly have a platform that feels and operates the same as the platform that a huge company would be using. Um, I do think in some ways that there are now methods where a company that can be 3 or 4 people, or 5 or 6 people, um, to go back to the DTC space, there are very, well, DTC brands that are doing very well for themselves that are, 20 or 30 people, and they're able to use smart advertising by using things like Instagram and a few other highly targeted methods for reaching customers, being really lean when it comes to how much office space they're taking up, how much they're, spending on manufacturing. Um, I think that there is certainly a way that you can use the sort of existing tech ecosystem to your advantage as a small business. And I think that there is some ways that you can really, um, if you can find a niche that is not being served right now and protect it in whatever way, you can be very successful. I think that, what we've largely seen and what I've observed is that it seems like a small business can do very well, if it does find a niche of doing a couple of things that people really, really enjoy, and it can grow large doing that. I think Rothy's is a D2C brand that's seen a lot of success sort of doing women's shoes that are a very particular style, very particular sort of vibe, and selling those at good margins. What small businesses aren't able to do in a way that maybe they would have been 20 or 30 years ago, when tech players weren't crowding out and weren't able to so easily blanket the space, is they can't be generalists. You have to have a market niche that you occupy very solidly and understand what you're doing and why your product is owns this niche. You can't be a generalist. You can't expect to just compete on selling commodity items, because you will get washed by either large competitors or a lot of Chinese companies that can do what you're doing for a lot cheaper.
Jake Swearingen, Deputy Editor at Business Insider. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.